People warn me. Not cruelly. Mostly they warn me with that particular brand of careful kindness that is more honest than anything said directly. A raised eyebrow over a wine glass. A pause half a beat too long before saying she seems lovely. My sister Rachel, who has never in her life said the comfortable thing when the honest thing was available, looked at me across a restaurant table 8 months before the wedding and said, "Emory, I just want to make sure you've thought about what happens when you're 60 and she's 40. I told her I had. I told her that Nadia and I had discussed it, that we were adults, that the gap was 14 years and not 40, that people made this work all the time. Rachel picked up her fork. "Okay," she said, in the voice of a woman who is writing something down in her mind. She was right, of course, but not in the way she thought she was. The problem with Nadia and me was never that she was 29 and I was 43. The problem, the real problem, the one that took me 3 years to fully understand, had almost nothing to do with the age gap at all. It had to do with what the age gap allowed us both to believe, what it let her perform, and what it let me accept. My name is Emory. I'm 46 now. I run a mid-sized landscape architecture firm, the kind that does corporate campuses and public parks, and occasionally something interesting enough that I care about it the way I used to care about everything. I have a house on the western edge of the city, a good dog named Callum who is large and emotionally perceptive in the way of certain dogs, and a marriage that ended 2 years ago in a way that felt, by the time it arrived, less like a catastrophe than a diagnosis. Something had been wrong for a long time. The confirmation just took longer than it should have. Nadia and I met at a client event, one of those early evening gallery openings that function as professional networking dressed in better clothes. She was working at the architecture firm that was collaborating on the project. Junior associate, sharp, funny in the dry observational way I find genuinely engaging. Wearing a dark blue blazer she'd clearly just bought and hadn't yet broken in. She seemed slightly uncomfortable in the room in a way I found appealing, like someone who was competent enough to be there, but honest enough not to pretend it was effortless. We talked for 40 minutes about built environments and unbuilt cities and a documentary about brutalist housing blocks we'd both happened to watch. I asked for her number. She gave it to me with the slight hesitation of someone making a considered decision, not a reflexive one. The age gap came up on our third date. She mentioned it plainly, the way she tended to approach anything she'd already thought through. "You know there's 14 years between us. Does that feel strange to you?" "Should it?" I said. She considered this. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a year." I thought, then, that this was honesty. I understand now it was the first of many things she said that I received as self-awareness and that were, in fact, performance. We married 2 years later. In the early autumn of the year, I turned 43. The ceremony was small, a registry office and a dinner with people we actually liked. Nadia wore something cream-colored and looked quietly happy in the photographs. I kept one on my desk for 3 years. 3 years of marriage. That's the full measure of it. 3 years, one shared dog, one mortgaged house, one slow building, carefully obscured deception, and one evening in March when I was standing at the kitchen counter reading something on my phone and I noticed, in the background reflection of the dark kitchen window, that Nadia was reading messages with the phone tilted deliberately away from me. It was a small thing, a micro-movement, the kind that lives in the gap between ordinary behavior and its opposite. I went back to what I was reading, but something in my chest had shifted half a degree. And that half degree, as it turned out, was everything. Our life together had a particular texture that I want to describe accurately, because I think it matters to what happened. Nadia is talented. She moved from junior associate to senior project designer in under 2 years, which is unusual enough that her firm made a small public note of it in a professional announcement. She had a quality I'd noticed from the beginning. She was exceptionally good at reading rooms, at calibrating her behavior to what a situation required, at giving people the version of herself that served the moment. I had always interpreted this as social intelligence. I am aware, in retrospect, of how much interpretive work I was doing in her favor. Our routines were comfortable. Mornings were efficient. Coffee made by me while she showered. A shared breakfast that rarely lasted more than 20 minutes before we both moved toward our separate days. Evenings varied. Sometimes we cooked together, sometimes we watched something. Sometimes she worked late at the firm while I worked in the home office, and Callum distributed himself between us in the approximate proportions of whoever had last fed him. There was genuine warmth in the early years. I want to be clear about that. I was not simply deceived into believing something good. There was something good for a time. The deception came later. Or rather, the deception came earlier than I knew, but its texture was better disguised in the early years when she was still building something. The first sign was the evenings. Around 6 months into year 3, so 18 months before the end, Nadia started spending Friday evenings differently. Not dramatically, just a gradual shift. More often out with colleagues from the firm, or attending professional events, or visiting her friend Saskia, who lived across the city and worked in interior design, and who I'd met 3 or 4 times and found genuine and uncomplicated. Friday evenings became Nadia's evenings, which I didn't question, partly because I respected her independence and partly because she had always been clearer about needing space than I was. What I noticed was not the Fridays themselves, but the quality of her on the Saturdays after. There was a version of her that appeared on those mornings, lighter, slightly distracted in a specific way, the way of someone whose mind is partly somewhere else, that was distinct from her ordinary Saturday self. She'd be generous with me in the mornings, almost deliberately so. Coffee refilled without asking. A hand on my shoulder as she passed. The kind of warmth that, over time, I began to feel was compensatory rather than spontaneous. I didn't name this. I filed it. The phone behavior evolved slowly. It had always been her practice to keep her phone with her. She received work messages late and responded to them, which was a genuine habit of her profession. But the screen-away thing began, gradually, to extend beyond work hours. On the sofa in the evenings. At the kitchen table. I'd walk into a room, and the phone would disappear into her lap with a smoothness that was either entirely unconscious or extremely practiced. There was a moment in November, 4 months before the end, that I keep returning to. We were driving back from a dinner at friends, late, the car warm against the cold outside, and she fell asleep in the passenger seat. Her phone was in her lap, and as I turned a corner it slid, and the screen lit briefly against her coat. I didn't read it. I couldn't. I was driving. But I saw, in the half-second of light, the beginning of a notification. A name. One I didn't recognize. I said nothing. I drove home. I helped her inside, slightly groggy, and she went straight upstairs, and I sat in the kitchen with Callum for a while in the dark. His name was Jonah. I didn't know that then. I knew it later. The thing about Jonah that the story requires me to say plainly is this. He was 25. 4 years younger than Nadia. 19 years younger than me. He worked at a studio that collaborated occasionally with her firm, a junior designer with the kind of effortless physical ease of someone who has not yet had enough time to develop much tension about anything. I'd see his name in her professional contacts when I wasn't yet looking for it, scrolling past in the ordinary background of her work life. He was, I eventually understood, what the age gap had always been pointing toward, not the cause of the end, but the shape it took. The change in Nadia's professional travel is where I began, quietly, to understand something was wrong. She had always traveled for work, site visits, client meetings, the occasional conference. It was unremarkable. But in the winter leading up to the end, the travel became slightly more frequent, and the details she offered about it became slightly less specific in a way I found difficult to articulate. When I asked about a site visit to a coastal development project she'd mentioned, she gave me accurate information, dates, location, purpose, but in a tone that had the flatness of recitation rather than the texture of experience. Like someone telling you the plot of a film they haven't seen. I mentioned this to Marcus, who remains, through all of it, the person I trust most in the world, and he listened and then said carefully, "What specifically feels off? Just the travel, or something else?" "The texture," I said. "When she talks about work, she talks differently. More detail, less structure. This is structured. Rehearsed," he said. I hadn't used that word. But yes, the January that preceded the end, Nadia attended what she described as a 2-day residential design workshop in the city, staying at a hotel because several participants were coming from out of town and the organizers had arranged a block booking. She showed me the email invitation. It looked entirely legitimate. A respected design institute, a recognizable list of facilitators, a proper registration confirmation. She came home on the Sunday evening with the slightly depleted energy of someone who'd had 2 full days of professional engagement. She described the sessions in enough detail to be convincing. She brought me back a small book from the Institute's shop, a monograph on a landscape designer I admired. I thanked her. I put it on my shelf. I noticed, 2 days later, that the spine hadn't been cracked and the price sticker was still on the back. You can buy a book you haven't read. People do it. It means nothing. But I found myself, that evening, on my laptop, looking up the workshop program on the Institute's website. It existed. The dates matched. The facilitators were real. What I found, further down the program listing, was the attendee registration approach, an open application process. No block hotel booking. Participants arranged their own accommodation. I sat with that for a while. Then I closed the laptop and took Callum for a long walk in the cold. The red herrings were numerous in this period, and I want to account for them honestly, because they shaped how long it took me to act. Nadia's colleague Petra, a woman in her late 30s who I knew slightly through work events, went through a difficult separation from her partner around this time and leaned on Nadia heavily. There were genuine late evenings that were genuinely about Petra. There were real phone conversations I'd overhear fragments of that sounded, in isolation, like things you'd say to someone in a painful situation. You don't have to make any decisions tonight, and I know. It's impossible, and once, quietly, in the back garden in the cold, sometimes you just have to accept what's already been decided. I thought those conversations were about Petra's marriage. It took me much longer than it should have to understand that some of them, not all, but some, were about her own. The second shift I noticed was in how Nadia talked about the future. In the early years of the marriage, she'd speak about future things with a kind of proprietorial confidence. When we eventually extend the kitchen, if we ever do that trip to Japan, I'd like to live somewhere with more light eventually. Small futures, practical and assumed. In year 3, those future references quietly stopped. I didn't notice their absence at first. I only noticed it when I made one of my own, mentioned renewing the garden landscaping in the spring, and she looked at me with an expression that was there and gone in a fraction of a second, but that I caught. Not enthusiasm, not even neutrality. Something closer to discomfort. She recovered immediately. That would be nice, she said. But I'd seen it, and I couldn't unsee it. I need to say something about what it feels like to investigate someone you love, or once loved, or love in a way that has become complicated by doubt. It doesn't feel powerful. It doesn't feel like taking control of a narrative. It feels like pressing on a bruise, necessary, slightly nauseating, each confirmation both expected and worse than you expected. I started paying attention to the logistics of the Fridays. Not following her, I didn't do that, but noticing the small arithmetic of how she left and returned. Time, mileage, on the occasions she drove, the charge level of her phone when she came home. These are ordinary numbers. They only become evidence when they don't add up. In February, I had an evening, a Thursday, when a work dinner I was meant to attend was canceled late. Nadia thought I was out. I came home early and found the house empty, which I expected, but also found that her calendar, which we shared for practical reasons, for planning, showed her at a studio meeting until 8. When she came home at 9, I asked how the meeting had gone. Useful, she said. Long. I checked the shared calendar the next morning. The meeting had been added retroactively. The timestamp on the entry was from the evening itself, created at 6:47 p.m. She had created the calendar event after arriving wherever she actually was. I called Marcus. I told him what I'd found. He listened, and then he said, "You need to talk to Diane." Diane was the same family law solicitor I'd used before, clear, unflappable, thorough. I called her the following week. We spoke for 40 minutes. She asked me the careful questions lawyers ask when they're mapping the terrain, and when I answered them, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "You don't have anything documented yet. Before you do anything, document." I documented. I kept a simple log, dates, times, stated plans, observable discrepancies. Not obsessively, not with any drama. Just the quiet forensic habit of a person who has spent 20 years working in a profession where unverified assumptions become structural failures. By the first week of March, I had 6 weeks of entries, each one individually explicable. Together, they described a consistent pattern of calendar manipulation, partial truths, and a social life whose edges didn't quite meet when you laid them against each other. And then I found the hotel receipt. It was in the inside pocket of a jacket she'd worn the previous weekend. I discovered it while sorting laundry, the jacket having ended up in my pile by mistake. A hotel receipt for one night, a small boutique place in the eastern quarter of the city. Her name. The date corresponded to the residential design workshop weekend. She hadn't stayed at the Institute's block booking that didn't exist. She'd stayed at a different hotel entirely. For one person, under her name only. I photographed the receipt, replaced it, finished the laundry. I fed Callum. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The hardest thing about this period was not the suspicion. It was the continuity. Life continued. I went to work. I came home. We made dinner. She showed me something on her phone, a renovation project she admired, a piece about a public plaza in Rotterdam. And I looked at it and offered a genuine opinion, because I am not capable of complete performance, but I am apparently capable of compartmentalizing enough to function. I don't know if that reflects well or badly on me. I think it's simply what people do when they are not yet ready to pull the thread. The name Jonah surfaced properly through something I hadn't planned. Nadia's laptop was open on the kitchen counter one afternoon while she was in the garden with Callum, and a notification appeared on her screen, a message in a browser-based platform. I wasn't positioned to read it, but I saw the sender's name at the top of the notification before it faded. That evening, I searched Jonah's name against her firm's project collaborators. There he was, junior designer, 25. His firm's website had a team page with photographs. He looked exactly as I'd imagined. The effortless physical ease I'd expected, the unguarded expression of someone who hasn't yet needed to guard much. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went to find Marcus. I chose a Sunday. Not because Sunday had any particular significance, but because it was a day with no professional obligations for either of us, because Callum would be walked and fed and the logistics of ordinary life already handled, and because I wanted to be able to speak without time pressure in either direction. We were having a late breakfast, the kind we'd had hundreds of times. Coffee, toast, the Sunday papers that Nadia still liked physical, and I'd long since switched to reading on my phone. The light was that low March quality, pale and even, coming through the kitchen windows. I said, "I want to talk to you about something." She looked up. Whatever she read in my face, I don't know precisely what she found there, but she found something, produced a very slight stilling in her body. The particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and has just heard the opening of it. "Okay," she said. "I know about Jonah," I said. A silence. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. She held my gaze throughout, which I'll say for her. She didn't look away. "How long have you known?" she said. Which was, I noted this, not a denial, not an explanation, just a redirect to the question of my knowledge. "Long enough," I said. "I'd rather know how long it's been." Another pause. Then, "Since October." 5 months. "Since October." "The workshop weekend," I said. She nodded. "The calendar entries," I said. "The Petra phone calls." She looked down then, not away from me, just down, at the table, at her coffee. "Some of those were actually about Petra," she said. "I know," I said. "That's what made it confusing." We sat in the quiet for a moment. Outside, Callum was moving around the garden, the familiar soft thud of his feet on the frozen grass. "I want to understand something," I said. "And I want you to tell me the truth, because I think the least we can do for each other is that." I paused. Did it start before or after the problem started? I've been going back and forth on this, and I genuinely can't determine which came first. She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't think I know how to answer that honestly," she said, finally. "Because I think the problems and him arriving they were happening at the same time. I don't think one caused the other." "That's a careful answer," I said. "It's an honest one," she said. We talked for almost 2 hours. Not calmly. There were moments of sharpness, of things said that landed with the weight of accumulated honesty finally uncaged. She told me that she had loved me, genuinely, in the early years. That she had not been performing then. That somewhere in year 2 something had shifted in how she experienced us. That she had started to feel the gap, not as something irrelevant, but as something that made her feel, in a way she struggled to articulate, like a younger version of a life in progress rather than someone making her own choices. "I know how that sounds," she said. "It sounds like something you should have told me." I said. "Yes," she said, without argument. Instead of, "Yes," she said again, quieter. I asked about Jonah, not with jealousy but with genuine curiosity, which I think surprised her. She described him with a care that told me what I needed to know. This was not casual. He was not an escape hatch. He was, for her, something she believed in. Are you in love with him? I said. A pause. I think so, she said. I nodded. I looked at the table. Callum had come to the back door and was looking through the glass at us with the concerned expression he sometimes wore when the emotional temperature in the house changed. Then I think we're done, I said. I know, she said. I thought she would cry. She didn't. I'm not sure what I felt about that. The composure of someone who had been preparing for this conversation in some form for 5 months. The months that followed were difficult in the particular ways divorces are difficult. The solicitors, the finances, the logistical unwinding of shared life. We were, all told, civil to each other in the way that people can be civil when the anger has burned itself out into something more like exhaustion. Nadia moved in with Saskia initially. She and Jonah are, as far as I know, still together. My sister Rachel came to see me 3 weeks after Nadia moved out. She did not say I told you so. She made dinner, and we ate it mostly in silence, and she said, at some point, "Are you okay?" "Not really," I said, "but I'm going to be." "That's enough," she said. "I have Callum. I have the house, the morning light through the east windows, the garden I landscaped myself 2 summers ago that looks better than anything I've designed professionally, because I was designing it only for myself. I have work that I still care about, and a small team of people I respect, and Marcus, who came over last spring and helped me repaint the kitchen a color that Nadia had never liked and that I had always thought would work well in that room. It worked well in that room. I think about the age gap a lot, differently than I used to, and more honestly. The people who warned me were not entirely wrong, but they were wrong about the mechanism. They imagined the gap would matter as time, that I would age into someone she no longer wanted, that the physical divergence would eventually become insurmountable. That's not what happened. What happened was more specific and, in some ways, more interesting. The age gap mattered because of what it meant for how we each entered the marriage. I was 43, someone who had lived enough to have figured out, roughly, who he was. My preferences, my needs, my tolerances, my work. I wasn't still becoming myself. Nadia, at 29, was. And the marriage, which she had chosen, which she had entered genuinely, eventually couldn't contain what she was becoming, because what she was becoming was not yet fully visible when she chose it. I don't say this to excuse the deception. The deception was its own thing, and it caused its own specific damage. The 5 months of hidden calendars and fake workshop hotels and Petra's name borrowed as cover. That was a choice she made, and it compounded the hurt of the end in ways I'm still untangling. But I understand, now, that the deception was also a form of terror. She was terrified of what leaving would mean. To me, to the marriage, to herself. She was not cold in the way of someone using a relationship strategically. She was more like someone who had been unable to find the door and had eventually gone through the wall instead. The lesson I take from it is not about age. It is about the particular danger of building a relationship around a static image of the other person, deciding who they are at the moment you choose them and not accounting for the reality that people continue to become themselves, sometimes in directions you didn't plan for. I was in love with the version of Nadia who hesitated before giving me her phone number and asked me, 3 dates in, whether the age gap felt strange. I was in love with her self-awareness. What I didn't account for was that self-awareness, in someone still forming, is not the same as having arrived anywhere in particular. It's just the ability to see clearly in the present. It says nothing about where you'll be in 3 years. What I'm building now is slower, and I am less certain about most things than I used to be, and I've come to believe that's appropriate. Callum sleeps at the foot of the bed, and the garden is doing well. Rachel visits most months. Marcus and I are talking about going somewhere cold and quiet for a week in the autumn. I am 46 years old and I understand, finally, clearly, in the way that only certain kinds of loss can teach you, that the right question is never can this work. It is always, am I willing to keep learning who this person is, as they keep becoming it? I am, I think, willing. I'm just doing it differently now, more honestly, with less accommodation and more curiosity, with the knowledge that patience, genuinely given, is only as valuable as what it's given toward. That has to be enough. And most days it is. The story of Emory and Nadia is not ultimately a story about betrayal in the conventional sense. It's a story about 2 people who entered a marriage at incompatible points in their own development, and about one person's inability to navigate the growing distance between who she was when she chose the marriage and who she was becoming within it. From a psychological standpoint, the most instructive element of this story isn't the affair. It's the pattern of Nadia's concealment, the retroactively added calendar entries, the workshop hotel, the borrowed details of Petra's genuine crisis used as camouflage. This is not the behavior of someone who is careless or impulsive. It is the behavior of someone operating in a state of cognitive dissonance, knowing what she wants to do, unable to reconcile it with who she needs herself to be, and resolving the gap through management rather than honesty. At what point do you think Nadia made the decision to stay and deceive rather than leave and be honest? That choice, to stay in the architecture of the marriage while already outside it emotionally, produced almost all of the specific damage in this story. Emory's response to the early signs is worth examining closely. The phone tilted in the kitchen window reflection, noted and filed. The mileage, the quality of the Saturdays after the Fridays, the uncracked spine of the book, each one received with the quiet, analytical patience of a person who trusts structure to eventually reveal its own contradictions. There is genuine intelligence in this, but also a cost. The patience that kept him from acting prematurely also kept him in a house where the emotional truth had already departed. Would you have moved earlier? And if so, on which detail, and what would you have done? The age gap functions in this story not as cause, but as context. Nadia's self-awareness at 29, the quality that first attracted Emory, was genuine. But self-awareness in a person still in formation is not the same as having settled into yourself. It's the ability to see clearly in the present moment. It makes no promises about the future. Emory's mistake, and it's a human one, not a moral one, was treating her early clarity as evidence of a completed self, rather than as a quality of someone still in motion. The confrontation is the story's emotional center, and what makes it work is the absence of performance from either party. Nadia doesn't deny. She redirects, then tells the truth. Emory asks not what happened, but why, a distinction that reveals something important about his character. He was never primarily looking for ammunition. He was looking for comprehension. And comprehension, painful as it was, is ultimately what allowed the ending to be something other than wreckage. The question, did it start before or after the problem started, is not the question of a wounded husband looking for someone to blame. It's the question of someone trying to understand the architecture of what failed so they can build more honestly next time. Viewed from a wider distance, the story of Emory and Nadia describes something universally recognizable: the experience of loving not a person, but your most complete understanding of a person at a single point in time, and the particular kind of loss that comes when they continue beyond the frame you held them in. This is the accumulation effect at its most subtle. No single moment in this story was catastrophic. The distance built in increments too small to demand response. A changed evening habit, a slightly flatter tone, a future tense quietly dropped from conversation. These were not failures of love. They were symptoms of a growing misalignment between who Nadia was becoming and the shape the marriage had been built to hold. And because neither party named this, because Emory was patient and Nadia was managing, the misalignment continued to widen long past the point where a genuine conversation might have allowed something different. The point of no return was not October, when the affair began. It was earlier, somewhere in the invisible months, when Nadia stopped building futures in her language and started experiencing the marriage as something already decided. By the time Jonah entered the picture, the emotional structure of the marriage had already quietly collapsed. The affair was less a cause than a consequence, and a symptom of something that had never been honestly addressed. The deepest lesson here is not about age. It's about the danger of static love, loving a fixed image of a person rather than committing to the ongoing, sometimes disorienting work of learning who they continue to become. Emory did not fail to love Nadia. He failed to keep asking who she was becoming. And Nadia did not stop loving Emory in a single moment. She grew past a version of herself that had needed exactly what he offered, and was unable to say so until the wall became the only available door. What remains, at the story's end, is not bitterness but clarity. A garden designed for one. A dog who understood the emotional temperature of the house before anyone admitted it out loud. And a question held lightly, without urgency. Am I willing to keep learning who this person is, as they keep becoming it? That question, applied honestly, is the only real protection against the kind of quiet erosion this story describes. Not certainty, just the willingness to keep asking.